On July 17, 2018, inside the Huntsville execution chamber, Christopher Young was strapped to a gurney and asked by the warden if he had a final statement. And what came out of his mouth shook everyone in that room. He looked toward the witnesses and said he wanted to make sure the Patel family knew he loved them like they loved him. Then he asked that the kids he had been mentoring keep the fight going. And then he said, "I'm good, warden." Those were the last 3 sentences Christopher Young ever spoke. And within minutes, he was declared dead at 6:38 p.m. But what makes those final words so devastating, so haunting, so impossible to forget is who he was saying them to, and why the family of the man he killed was the very group begging the state of Texas to let him live. That contradiction, that heartbreak, is what this story is really about. July 17th, 2018 did not begin quietly. It began with Christopher Young knowing with complete certainty that this was the last morning he would ever see. His legal team had spent the final days in a desperate sprint filing appeals and a federal civil rights lawsuit arguing that racial bias had poisoned the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, which had unanimously rejected his clemency petition just the week before. His attorneys pointed to the fact that earlier that same year, a white Texas inmate named Thomas Whitaker had received a rare sentence commutation as his execution approached. A man convicted of orchestrating the murders of his own mother and brother. Christopher Young was black, convicted of a robbery murder, and had the victim's own family standing in his corner. And he still could not get a single board member to spare his life. The federal judge in Houston dismissed the lawsuit. The appeals courts rejected every motion. Governor Greg Abbott, who had the power to issue a 30-day reprieve, said nothing. By the time the sun rose on July 17th, every legal avenue had been sealed off. But before we get to the chamber, there is something that happened the day before that you need to understand, because without it, Christopher Young's final words don't fully land the way they should. On July 16th, the day before the execution, a man named Mitesh Patel drove 3.5 hours from San Antonio to the Walls unit in Huntsville. Mitesh was not a death penalty activist or a stranger to this case. He was the son of Hasmukh Patel, the 55-year-old convenience store owner who Christopher Young had shot and killed during a robbery back in November 2004. Mitesh had identified his father's body after the shooting. He had testified at trial. He had carried that grief for 14 years. And yet, on the eve of the execution, he was the one making the drive to see Christopher Young in person because he was the one asking the state of Texas not to kill him. Inside the visitation room, separated only by a pane of glass, the 2 men spoke on a phone handset, and something quietly extraordinary happened. Young apologized and told Mitesh that he should have never walked into that store, that Mitesh's father deserved to still be alive. Mitesh asked him about his years on death row, about his daughter, about the mentoring work he had been doing with troubled youth from inside a prison cell. And when Mitesh walked out of that building, he told reporters he felt a deep sense of sadness, not closure, not relief, sadness. "I really do believe Chris Young today is not the person he was 14 years ago," he said. "2 wrongs don't make a right. Killing Chris doesn't change my path, my history." The son of the murder victim went home that night believing an irreversibly changed man was about to be put to death the next morning against his family's wishes. Now, keep that in mind as we walk through what July 17th actually looked like for Christopher Young. Young had made a deliberate decision about how he wanted to spend his final hours. He had removed almost everyone from his execution day visitor list, a choice that reflected who he had become over more than a decade on death row. He did not want his friends watching him die. He did not want his daughters seeing that. The one person he kept on that list was his aunt, Valerie Harris, who had been designated as his spiritual advisor, so she could be present with him in the hours before he was taken to the chamber. Valerie had been one of the most visible voices fighting for his life. Just weeks earlier, she had stood in front of the San Antonio Cathedral in the city's main plaza, tears and sweat running down her face, and told Governor Abbott that if he needed a body, she would trade her life for Christopher's without hesitation. She meant it. And on July 17th, she was the one beside him. What Valerie knew, and what the people who had spent time with Young on death row had watched with their own eyes, was that the man sitting in that cell in 2018 bore almost no resemblance to the 21-year-old who had walked into Hash Patel's store nearly 24 beers and a cocaine binge deep on a Sunday morning in November 2004. Over his years on death row, Young had educated himself, painted, written, and read incessantly. When he discovered that a fellow inmate on his unit was planning to take his own life, Young stayed up through the entire night talking that man down. He had connected with the troubled young people his aunt began bringing to see him from her church, young men and women on the edge of making the same kinds of choices he had made. And he would sit with them and share his story and push them towards something better. His former educator, Carolyn Ross, who had known him as a kid in San Antonio's alternative school system, said those conversations gave Young a sense of purpose he had never had before. It was like he found a purpose, his aunt said, and he had. The question the Patel family, his legal team, and tens of thousands of people who signed a clemency petition were all asking was whether that purpose was worth more alive than extinguished. The state of Texas answered that question at 6:13 p.m. on July 17, 2018, when the lethal injection of pentobarbital began. Witnesses in the chamber later described what they saw. Young felt it immediately, using an obscenity twice to say he could taste it and that it was burning. Within about 30 seconds of that, he stopped moving. He was pronounced dead at 6:38 p.m. He was 34 years old. His daughter, Chrissy, who had been only 2 years old when he was sent to prison, had grown up visiting him through glass and phone handsets. She had grown up with a father who told her every single visit that he was in prison because of his own choices and that she should stay away from people like him and surround herself with good ones. That was his fatherhood. That was the only fatherhood she ever knew, and now it was over. When the news reached the Patel family that evening, the room went silent. Then the family heard the broadcast of Christopher Young's final words, and what they heard was his voice saying that he loved them like they loved him. He had used the last breath of his life to tell the family of the man he killed that he carried them in his heart. For Mitesh Patel, who had spent the night before sitting across a glass partition from the man who had destroyed his family and had somehow walked out of that room believing in him, those words arrived like something that could not be undone. His aunt, Valerie, after the execution, made her way to the Polunsky unit where Young had spent his years on death row, sitting with his closest friends there, letting them grieve, and making a plan to continue the outreach work he had started. She was not going to let his last request go unfulfilled. That outreach work became the Christopher Young Foundation, formally organized as a nonprofit with 501c3 status, dedicated to love, forgiveness, and second chances, the three things Young had embodied in those final years of his life. Caroline Ross, his former educator, began working to carry forward the mentoring mission he had specifically called out from the gurney, recruiting coaches and community figures in San Antonio to reach young people who were where Christopher Young once was. The last thing he ever said publicly was a request not for himself, not for justice, not even for acknowledgement. It was a request on behalf of the kids.
Keep the fight going.
And there are people years later who are still doing exactly that. What Christopher Young's story leaves behind is not a simple or comfortable feeling. It is not a story where the system worked or where everyone got what they deserved. It is a story where the murder victim's own son drove 3.5 hours to ask the government not to execute the man who killed his father and was ignored. It is a story where a death row inmate spent over a decade becoming genuinely and documentably different, and where that transformation was acknowledged by judges, journalists, activists, and the victim's family alike, and it still was not enough. And it is a story where a man's final words were not about himself at all. They were about the people he loved, and the young people he would never see again. Christopher Young said he was good, and then the warden nodded, and it was done.